Did you know? Virtual Boy wasn't Nintendo's biggest failure. Despite its reputation, it actually sold more than the Satellaview and 64DD combined, and outsold most of its 32-bit competitors like Atari Jaguar. But it could have sold so much more. Codenamed VR32, the system was envisioned by its creator as small and portable as a pair of sunglasses, where it would give birth to new genres in infinite darkness. But government regulations, Nintendo rushing it out before it was ready, then failing to support it after launch, all culminated in a Frankenstein's monster that wasn't what it was supposed to be. But even after all that, a lot of its games turned out pretty good, actually. Virtual Boy's become a meme nowadays, but if you dig through 90s magazines, you might be surprised at some of the review scores. Unfortunately, the old boy had his plug pulled after a few short months. So Nintendo could focus all their might on N64 defeating PlayStation, thus dooming Virtual Boy to the waste bin of history. In this video, we're going to look at its creation, tragically short lifespan, and why things turned out the way they did. This is the full story of the Nintendo Virtual Boy. Before we begin, it's important to understand the context of the Virtual Boy's origins. Looking back nowadays, some people think of it as an aberration. In the 90s, there were home consoles and handhelds, but Virtual Boy was neither. They think of it as a weird, one-of-a-kind machine. But actually, it was just one relative in a long bloodline. Its most ancient ancestor was the Vectrex 3D imager. It launched in 1984 and offered gamers their first glimpse into stereoscopic 3D. In 1987, Nintendo released the Famicom 3D system, and Sega put out the Sega Scope 3D for Master System. Then in 1991, Sega announced they'd begun development on the next generation, Sega VR for Genesis. It's important to note, though, that those were all home console accessories. They weren't standalone systems, and certainly not portable. It was in that context that Shigeru Miyamoto started pestering Gunpei Yokoi to throw his hat in the ring. Our last video was Yokoi's life story, but in case you missed it, he'd been Nintendo's lead inventor since the 1960s, who nowadays is best known for Game & Watch and Game Boy. At the time, I was interested in virtual reality, remembers Miyamoto, and was one of the staff that went on and on about how we could do something with 3D goggles. I didn't exactly twist his arm, but I would talk to Yokoi about it. Nintendo president Yamauchi wanted Yokoi to explore it too. Eventually, he ordered him to do it. Nintendo games had always been 2D, but technology was getting to a point where 3D was the next logical step. So the plan was Nintendo would jump into the next dimension with 2 consoles, each from a different angle. Project Reality would make use of 3D polygons, while VR32 would use stereoscopic 3D. True virtual reality was technically possible, but would have been far too big, expensive, and Yokoi didn't think it well suited to Nintendo's visual style. Mario jumping 20 feet in the air, doubling his height with mushrooms, those kind of fantastical ideas just wouldn't translate to VR realism. Realistic visuals should never be our goal, said Yokoi. The essence of Nintendo games is seeing how much we can stimulate people's imaginations with symbolic distortions of reality. Yokoi tinkered around for a while, but it wasn't till a man from Massachusetts walked through his door that the project began in earnest. His name was Alan Becker. He'd invented a red light technology back in '86, with the idea it had fit over one eye for surgeons and aircraft mechanics when they need to consult vital signs or schematics, but their hands are busy. It was basically a primitive 80s version of Google Glass, if you remember what that is. It hadn't caught on though, so Becker started pitching the technology to game companies. Sega, Mattel, Hasbro, they'd all turned him down, But in 1991, Becker brought it to Nintendo, where Yokoi saw potential that others couldn't. At the time, Yokoi had grown dissatisfied with where video games were headed. He'd been at Nintendo since 1965, back when they mostly just made playing cards. It was largely thanks to his inventions that Nintendo evolved into the global gaming giant they are today. He'd seen the evolution of games from literal toys to simple handhelds to 8-bit consoles, then 16-bits, and soon it'd be on to 32, then 64. It had become a technological arms race, with console makers competing over graphics. But that's not what video games were about. Not to him. Making good games is about coming up with good ideas, he said in his biography. But companies have been using an escape route for their lack of ideas, better graphics, and more colors. Yokoi predicted the bit wars would lead to a future where the console market would get conquered by companies who could produce the best visuals. And that was a battle Nintendo wouldn't win. Time would eventually prove him right, as Nintendo's market share got chipped away by the likes of Sega and decimated by Sony. Yokoi believed if Nintendo was gonna survive, they'd have to leave the arms race behind and fight on the battlefield of ideas. They'd have to make new kinds of games no one had ever seen before, and let everyone else compete on processing power. Yokoi was also a big believer in breaking games out of the confines of a TV screen. Back in the 70s, he made Wild Gunman and Duck Hunt that put a gun in your hand and ducks in your living room. His Famicom light gun, Rob the Robot, and Super Scope bled into reality as well. Game & Watch and Game Boy were the same idea, but in reverse, letting players escape the living room and play games out in the real world. The next portable system, codenamed VR32, was a further evolution of that idea, with games literally popping off the screen and into your eyeballs, wherever you wanted to take it. It'd be as small as a pair of sunglasses you can slip on anywhere. Yokoi likened it to how people had spent decades listening to music at home. Then Sony's Walkman came along in 1979, and suddenly they could take music with them. Hearing your favorite song on a train while staring at the sunset hits completely different than hearing the same song at home. Scientifically speaking, it sends a whole other rush of chemicals into your brain. Sony opened up a whole new world for music, and now Nintendo was gonna do it for 3D. VR32 would also have motion tracking, so wherever you moved your head, it'd move your in-game perspective. Yokoi was especially fascinated by the total blackness that surrounded a user's vision. He told kids who spend all day in front of their TVs to try walking out their back door at night. The same yard that seemed so ordinary in daylight, now that it's draped in darkness, feels like a separate reality, with an inescapable sense that something inhuman lurks in the shadows. There are more thrilling spaces in utter darkness, he said, than there are in video games on a TV screen. That's the space VR32 would inhabit, and give birth to entirely new genres. Yokoi's biography says, for example, if you used it out in the hills, nocturnal creatures like tanukis and foxes that hide during the day would appear on the screen, and you'd play a game where you catch them. In short, VR32 would offer unprecedented kinds of gameplay and draw in people who weren't even gamers, just like Game & Watch and Game Boy had done in the 80s. The system was designed by Yokoi's department, Nintendo R&D 1, who also made a lot of its titles. In addition to Game & Watch and Game Boy, they'd also made a lot of the company's most famous games, including all the Metroids, Super Mario Lands, Famicom Detective Clubs, and a whole lot more. Basically, almost every game Nintendo had ever made up to that point, except the ones by Miyamoto. Miyamoto was keen to make games too, though. It was him, after all, who wanted Yokoi to make VR32 in the first place. prior to release, he told Famitsu, "My goal is something so amazing, people aren't sure if they can even call it a video game. I want to make something with the power to pull in all kinds of ordinary people, the way Space Invaders and Super Mario did." In that same interview, Miyamoto said he was also thinking about porting over Star Fox 2, which was originally developed for Super Nintendo, but now he thought maybe it'd be a better fit for VR32. So, all that to say, between R&D 1's hardware experience, their track record of hit games, and Miyamoto himself getting in on the action, VR32 was on track to be an awesome machine with mind-blowing games. Unfortunately, there were some hiccups during development, and the final product didn't turn out as Yokoi envisioned. Much of the blame can be laid at the feet of government regulations. A radio law forced him to add a metal shield between the system and the user's head to protect from radio waves that, at the time, were thought might be harmful to people's brains, which meant VR32 would have to be a lot bigger than a pair of sunglasses. Another problem was Japan's new product liability law, which basically said companies could be sued if consumers got injured using their products. If a kid walked into traffic with VR over his eyes, legally, it would be Nintendo's fault when he got hit by a bus, which meant VR32 could no longer be a wearable. It had to comply not just with Japanese law, but America's FCC and other regulators around the world. So the system had to get bigger, heavier, and unwearable, which means it couldn't have head tracking either. The machine they ended up with weighed 2 pounds and had to rest on a 2-legged stand. Instead of slipping it on anywhere, now gamers would have to leave it at home and lean over to stick their faces in. It was a far cry from Yokoi's original vision, and the backyard at midnight ideas he dreamed of were no longer possible. Instead, VB games would have to focus on traditional pick-up-and-play games like 2D Mario, Pinball, and Tetris. It was the blue ocean strategy, growing the market by appealing to regular folks. That stood in contrast to the red ocean, where all game companies fought for the same shrinking customer base of hardcore gamers, like sharks feeding on a dwindling supply of fish. Yokoi still hoped it'd breed new kinds of games too, but they'd have to exist in Virtual Boy as it was instead of what it was supposed to be. A tough situation was made worse though when Nintendo started pressuring him to release it sooner than he wanted. In 1993, Sega showed off Sega VR, which looked almost ready for market, and a wave of 32-bit competitors would soon follow, from 3DO and Atari Jaguar to Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation. Super Nintendo's 16-bit graphics looked ancient in comparison, and Nintendo 64 wasn't going to be ready till 1996. Nintendo wanted to release a new system as soon as possible to keep their investors happy and maintain relevance. Yokoi didn't think it was ready yet, but the call wasn't his to make. In April '94, President Yamauchi made the big announcement and said it would be playable at Space World later that year, and hit store shelves a few months later. Press foretold of an imminent battle between Sega VR and Nintendo VR32 as a new battlefield in the gaming wars.
Not 100% won over, but I want to give it a chance, and I want to see what other games are coming out for it.
Space World 94. Yamauchi climbed on stage and praised its innovation and affordability. At $200, the newly renamed Virtual Boy was going to sell for less than half the price of other 32-bit systems like Saturn and PlayStation. 3 games were rushed out as demos: Galactic Pinball, Tellero Boxer, and Mario Bros. VB. Every gaming journalist from Tokyo to Timbuktu was there, eager to shove their face into Nintendo's new system. It's generally remembered that all press hated it. But if you go back and read magazines, the reception was actually pretty mixed. Some were fully on board for the 3D future, while others detested the black and red graphics. Yokoi told them in testing, color made a lot of users see double, while red only gave a better 3D effect and improved resolution. Giving it color also would have made its retail price over $500, which in today's money is over $1,000. A few magazines claimed that Virtual Boy was bad for your eyes, but Yokoi insisted they did extensive tests with Harvard eye doctors. And truth was, VB's actually good for your eyes. It's like a workout for your eyeballs. By switching focus from graphics up close and far away, you're literally stretching your eye muscles. Yeah, maybe your eyes would feel tired after a play session, but the same could be said for your arms after lifting weights. Yokoi said, if anything, it'll improve your eyesight, but no one paid him much attention. Another criticism was that playing Virtual Boy is too much of a solitary experience. Your friends can't watch or give advice because you're in your own little world. Nintendo promised a link cable would soon make multiplayer possible, but in their rush, they didn't finish the link cable in time for Space World. Ultimately, the system's solitary nature was one of the reasons it failed to catch on. How many times have you bought a system after seeing your friend play it, or because you had a blast playing together? It's a form of free marketing that Virtual Boy just didn't get. 3D graphics couldn't be reproduced in TV or magazine ads either, further limiting how many people could see it and believe it. All that said, what often gets overlooked nowadays is what people universally liked about Virtual Boy. Edge magazine was one of Virtual Boy's biggest haters, but even they wrote up the controller as innovative and comfortable thanks to its M-shaped design. Ergonomically, it was far ahead of its time, and no other controller came close. It also had dual D-pads, enabling gameplay that wasn't possible on other systems. PlayStation, for example, originally shipped with one D-pad, and didn't go dual analog till mid-97. It was rather fitting that Nintendo got there first, seeing as Yokoi invented the modern D-pad back in the Game & Watch era. Virtual Boy was also widescreen, a decade before the norm. Technically, with a 12:7 aspect ratio, it wasn't quite as wide as 16:9, but it was a heck of a lot wider than 90s home consoles. It also ran at 50 frames a second, and unlike most other systems, Virtual Boy was region-free, so you could play Japanese games on American systems and vice versa. Virtual Boy also had a unique audio feel, most comparable to a souped-up Game Boy, but with the added advantage of having 2 high-quality speakers for stereo sound. And while Game Boy only had 4 audio channels, Virtual Boy had 6, making it sound like this.
Welcome to Space World. Let's go.
So all that said, some in the press loved it, some hated it, and some things even the haters liked. But how was Nintendo feeling? Yokoi was starting to feel 50-50 about its chances, but Nintendo itself was exuding nothing but confidence. They projected in its first year it'd sell 3 million units in Japan, and another 1.5 million in America. That's more than Super Famicom sold in its first year. Nintendo pledged 1 new first-party game each and every month. Third parties were enthusiastic as well. More and more kept throwing their hats into the ring, from Squaresoft to Rare, till eventually about 100 were making Virtual Boy games. Even Game Freak was thinking about doing one. Perhaps the most enthusiastic developer, though, was Hudson Soft, who were probably most famous for their Bomberman franchise. They were the first third party to ever make video games for a Nintendo system back in 1984, and now they were all in on Red. Quote, "Our CEO is saying Virtual Boy is a business chance, and it's not an exaggeration to say Hudson is staking its future on it." VB Fever got so hot that Atari responded by announcing their own headset, Jaguar VR. Around the same time, Sega VR fizzled into vaporware, which meant at launch, Nintendo would have the market all to themselves. Virtual Boy had its haters, to be sure, but a lot of magazines thought it was going to be huge, with page after page acting like it was descending from heaven to bless us with the future of gaming. Nintendo and third parties were spamming ads all over the place, from print to television.
初めての完全立体映像ゲーム機バーチャルボーイ誕生。左右の目に異なる映像を映すことでテレビゲームでは表現できない立体感を生み出した。テニス、ボクシング、マリオの立体アクションゲームなど同時発売。バーチャルボーイ、ゲームの新しい時代が。
Hype was reinforced by its launch in April 95, the same month as Satellaview. We did a 45-minute video on Satellaview a while ago, if you're not familiar with the add-on, but the point is, it beamed games down to Super Famicoms via satellite and furthered the sense that April was the month Nintendo was getting a jump start on the 21st century. In March, though, VB's release got pushed back a few months, but with the accompanying good news that instead of $200, now it was going to sell for $150. Across the pond, Nintendo of America told retailers it'd be one of the biggest launches of all time, with support from a $25 million ad campaign. Nintendo Power was gonna push it hard every month, along with ad buys in the most popular gaming magazines, radio commercials in the top 50 markets, and VB news segments shown on major airlines. The biggest ad campaign, though, was TV commercials.
It came from the third dimension, with its own brain, its own voice, its own legs. There's only one problem. It needs your eyes. Virtual Boy. See it now in 3D.
Nintendo of America was also going on a mall tour across the country, setting up booths where passers-by could try out Virtual Boys. Demo stations were set up in Blockbusters nationwide, along with a promotion that let you rent a Virtual Boy and 3 games for 3 nights for just $10. After returning it to Blockbuster, you'd get a $10 coupon to buy a Virtual Boy of your own. So in effect, the rental was like a free trial you could take home for a few days. There were so many promotions, advertisements, and sweepstakes that we don't have time to go over all of them. But suffice it to say, Nintendo of America was throwing the kitchen sink at it, and it was confident that it would pay off. The big day was set for July 21st, 1995 in Japan, and a few weeks later in the US. Launch day was the moment of truth, so we're going to take a good look at all 5 launch titles, which sold for about $50 each. You've probably seen YouTubers take steaming dumps on these games, but for the historical perspective, instead of our own opinions, we'll see what magazines thought at the time of their release. Famitsu was basically the only Japanese magazine scoring games back then, and with 4 reviewers per game, they're Japan's gold standard for good reason. There were a lot more reviewers overseas, so we'll take their scores and average them out, to give you an idea what the consensus was in 1995. Okay, with all that said, let's get to the launch lineup. In America, Virtual Boys cost $30 more, but they came with Mario's Tennis as a pack-in title. Its sequels on N64 and GameCube are probably more famous, but the series actually got its start right here on Virtual Boy. In fact, it's the first sports game to ever have Mario in the title. Famitsu scored it 6.5, saying it played like a normal tennis game, in a good way, but with the benefit of great 3D depth. Keep in mind going forward that Famitsu generally scores games lower than their Western counterparts. From them, 5 basically means average. In the West, magazines scored Mario's Tennis in the high 7s, calling it a fun pick-up-and-play sports title. The game was generally well-liked, though the most common complaint was its lack of multiplayer. Earlier on, Nintendo announced it would have multiplayer, but the VB link cable got delayed again, and still wasn't ready on launch day. As a result, Mario's Tennis had to ship single-player only. Galactic Pinball. There are 4 distinct tables, with one featuring Samus and her alien foes, setting the stage for Metroid Prime Pinball a decade later. About half this game's dev team came over after making Super Metroid, including the composer. As a result, it's got probably the best soundtrack on the system, including a rendition of Super Metroid's prologue theme. Famitsu gave it a 6, liking the cheesy sci-fi vibes and clever mechanics, but docking points because they felt the puck was too slippery. Western outlets scored it mid-6s, saying it was fun in short bursts, but not a system seller. Tolero Boxer was directed by Yoshio Sakamoto, who also directed Super Metroid. Set in the 22nd century, it's basically Punch-Out, but with robots, and a deeper combat system. Each D-pad controls one fist, for blocking different kinds of punches, and so on. Famitsu scored it just under a 6, with points docked for not being able to move your feet. And also because it's only got 8 characters, while Super Punch-Out had 16, making this game feel a little rushed in comparison. Westerners scored it in the mid-6s, with some feeling it should have been branded as an actual Punch-Out game. Panic Bomber, a Bomberman puzzle game that played a lot like Puyo Puyo, made by Hudson Soft, the guys who publicly staked their future on Virtual Boy's success. Unfortunately, Famitsu considered it the weakest launch title and gave it a 5. They criticized it for failing to take advantage of the hardware and said there was no reason it even needed to be on Virtual Boy. They also drew issue with the lack of multiplayer, though that was really Nintendo's fault for not having the link cable available at launch. In America, Panic Bomber wasn't a launch title, but when it came out a few months later, it got a 6. Reviewers called it addictive and kinda fun, but would have preferred a real Bomberman instead. A lot of VB games were set in the future, and Red Alarm was no exception. A rogue AI's trying to wipe out humanity, which you've got to stop by flying through 6 levels and killing 6 bosses. It plays a lot like Star Fox All-Range mode, but uses both D-pads for precise maneuvering. It might look like a cluttered mess of red lines here on YouTube, but you'll have to take our word for it that in 3D, it makes more visual sense. Famitsu loved the graphics, proclaiming them cool, tasteful, and nostalgic for games of the past. They gave Red Alarm a 6.5 and recommended it as the best launch title of the bunch, saying it was even better than a lot of space shooters on PlayStation and Saturn. Overseas magazines scored it in the 7s, with GameFan going as high as a 9.5 and calling it one of the best games they've ever played. So, as you can see, contemporary reviews didn't pan the games as trash. On the contrary, they ranged from average to fantastic. A lot of magazines thought Virtual Boy had a bright future ahead of it, but they did worry that not having a big Mario, Zelda, or Metroid was going to handicap it at launch. The Metroid cameos in Galactic Pinball were nice, but an actual Metroid would have been better, and the system's dark graphics and sound chip would have paired well with the series' atmosphere. Some outlets were puzzled that Nintendo took their most experienced devs and had them make tennis, boxing, and pinball instead of something higher profile. A couple Mario games were coming soon, but not having them at launch was a problem. Yokoi was candid and told press it released before a good enough launch lineup was even ready. Another Japanese magazine, Famimaga, went to a popular game shop to see the long lines on release day. They were expecting enthusiasm on par with a typical Nintendo system, but were surprised when only 40 people showed up. They checked at another store, but the situation was the same there too. To be frank, there are very few VB users today, they wrote in what was supposed to be their big launch issue. However, if they can release games, that'll draw in fans. It'll raise the status of Virtual Boy and inevitably lead to more hardware and software sales. We don't want this to be the end. It was clear that hardcore gamers just didn't care about Virtual Boy, but that was exactly the demographic Yokoi wasn't going after. General entertainment publications mostly enjoyed it, like Popular Science and Entertainment Weekly, and kids liked it too. So he went to Yamauchi and said, "Let's stop courting gaming magazines who are run by enthusiasts and target the general public instead. That if we, quote, advertise Virtual Boys not for gamers, I think that could rekindle people's interest." Yokoi thought there was still a 50-50 chance he could turn things around and win over the Blue Ocean. As he saw it, that was the only hope for Nintendo's future, as they were doomed to lose the home console war. He practically begged for a $10 million ad budget to do just that, but he didn't get it. Only 17 more games ever came out. 4 of them landed in its second month, starting with Golf. Famitsu gave it 6.5, saying it made good use of 3D depth and otherwise was just a solid golf game. One of them called it a perfect game, helped along by the fact golf's a sport best played in solitude and thus a good fit for the hardware. Western magazines didn't see it that way though and gave it a 6. Another sports title released the same day, Virtual League Baseball was universally panned by critics. The graphics were ugly, it didn't make good use of 3D, and Famitsu said the computer opponent was, quote, a bit of a pain in the arse. They scored it less than a 5, while Western outlets gave it barely more than a 5. This one was supposed to have multiplayer too, but Nintendo still hadn't released the link cable. Another game from Hudson Soft, Vertical Force, is a pretty typical space shooter, but with a 3D gimmick that lets you switch between 2 altitudes, flying higher or lower to shoot, dodge, and duck under structures. All 4 Famitsu reviewers agreed it's a 6, except one guy who gave it a 3. Westerners gave it 5.5, saying it's a decent space shooter making good use of the hardware, but only fans of the genre should consider dropping $50 on it. V-Tetris comes with the classic Tetris we all know and love, but also includes a new mode as its main attraction. Basically, you've got to spin the board around on a circular plane to eliminate Tetronimos on all sides. It's an interesting twist, but Famitsu scored it just over a 5, saying the concept was doable in 2D and should have made more clever use of the third dimension. They also docked points for the lack of multiplayer. Once again, it was supposed to have multiplayer, but couldn't because no link cable. Western magazines didn't review V-Tetris, as it was the first of many that never left Japan. At this point, VB sales were continuing to flounder, and Yokoi was still trying to find ways to make it portable. He patented a VB shoulder mount that honestly doesn't even look feasible as something you'd want to take out of the house. But he was getting desperate. He'd saved Nintendo twice already, and now felt he had to one more time. But Nintendo never would have released the shoulder mount anyway because of the product liability law, and they were still dragging their feet even on the link cable. Rather than draw out the suspense, I'll just go ahead and tell you. Nintendo kept delaying it, till eventually just never releasing it at all. Link cables should have been easy to produce, but Nintendo simply wasn't giving VB the resources it needed. Speaking of liability laws, they'd also forced Nintendo to stick a bunch of warnings in the VB instruction manual, saying it could cause headaches, blurred vision, and other problems. Yokoi pointed out that other systems have the same kind of warnings. PlayStation's manual says it could harm your eyes, cause eye strain, and users should take a 15-minute break every hour. N64 warns of dizziness, motion sickness, and lighting your house on fire. But nobody paid him any attention. Virtual Boy was a new kind of machine, so people did take its warnings seriously. The manual was just a collection of warnings, each more terrifying than the last, said Yokoi. If someone had the misfortune to read them, they'd think our machine was really dangerous for their health. By default, it was also made to ask players to take a break every 30 minutes. Even nowadays, when Switch tells people to take a break, they just ignore it. But when Virtual Boy gave the same prompt, some folks genuinely thought their eyes were gonna get damaged. In truth, VB was good for your eyes, and the vast majority of players didn't get headaches. But the forced warnings furthered public perception that Virtual Boy was a death trap. The next month, September, only got 3 games. Jack Bros was made by Atlus as a spin-off of their Megami Tensei series. It was the first of the franchise released outside Japan, and paved the way for Persona and all of the rest. The 3 titular Jack brothers all play a bit differently, blasting their way through 60 maze-like floors, hunting for keys, and trying not to run out of time. The game uses the double D-pads like a modern twin-stick shooter, one for moving and one for aiming. Again, that was pretty impressive for its time, and wouldn't have been possible on other systems till 1997. Famitsu wasn't super keen on Jack Bros though, and gave it a 5. But the West praised its innovative controls, 3D depth, addictive gameplay, and gave it closer to an 8. Another game set in a sci-fi future, Space Squash, is basically tennis with jetpacks, where you can damage your opponent and grab pickups along the way. One D-pad moves, the other whacks balls in different directions. Space Squash never came stateside, but in Japan it got a 5, with Famitsu saying it was fun with good 3D, but felt a bit rushed and short on ideas. September also saw, at long last, the system's first mainline Mario. Mario Clash was made by R&D 1 as a reimagining of the original Mario Brothers. Mario Bros. VB was just a rushed-out tech demo for Space World and never got released as an actual game. But this was the real deal. Mario Clash has 99 levels that, like the original, ask you to kill every enemy on screen to make progress. All 4 Famitsu reviewers gave it a 6, calling it simple and old-fashioned, but undeniably well-made and a good fit for the hardware. Western magazines gave it about a 7, saying it's addictive and fun, though a little too close to the source material. As a side note, Mario Clash had the same composer as Metroid 2, so the two games often sound a lot alike. The original Mario Brothers and Mario Clash were both produced by Yokoi, but Miyamoto was conspicuously absent from the reimagining. So where was Miyamoto? Despite pushing Yokoi to make Virtual Boy in the first place and saying he wanted to blow people away with new experiences, he never got around to it. He was just too busy with Nintendo's other 3D machine. Mario 64 and Mario Kart 64 were both behind schedule. Zelda 64 was having problems, and meanwhile, he was overseeing quite a few other projects as well, including Pokémon, which at this point was 5 years behind schedule. Nintendo had overloaded Miyamoto with too many projects, and as a result, he didn't have a single second left over for Virtual Boy. In fact, the entire company was stretched thin, working on N64, Game Boy, Super Nintendo, Satellaview, and Virtual Boy all at once. Nintendo executives would later admit this was a bad idea. By now, in October 95, it was clear that Virtual Boy wasn't the explosive hit Nintendo expected. In America, 300,000 people a week were renting them at Blockbusters, but only a tiny percentage followed through with a purchase. So stateside, they dropped the price from $180 down to $160. And despite Nintendo's initial pledge to release a new first-party game every month, by now they'd only released one since launch, and it was going to be a while till the next one. More third-party games would have helped fill out the schedule, but unfortunately, early on, Yamauchi was worried someone would steal their technology, so he didn't give out dev kits till after it was revealed to the public. As a result, there weren't many games in its first few months. After launch, third parties saw the system wasn't selling, so a lot of them either cancelled their ongoing projects or just didn't bother starting new ones. That left the release calendar pretty barren, which was another reason the system ultimately failed. October only got 2 releases, starting with Virtual Fishing from the same guys who made V-Tetris. It was a pretty straightforward fishing game, with tournaments and 6 areas. Famitsu scored it just shy of a 5, with mixed opinions. One guy said it was fun and looked great, while another called it boring and ugly. Most of them liked the naturalistic visuals, but lamented the lack of naturalistic music to go along with it. Virtual Fishing never left Japan, and neither would this next one. As a first-person survival horror, Innsmouth no Yakata was arguably the most distinct game on the platform. It also stood out in terms of setting. Instead of the near future, it's the near past. You play as a private eye in 1922, trying to escape a Lovecraftian mansion with randomized monster and item locations. Similar to Jack Bros, every floor has keys to find in a time limit, with one D-pad moving and the other shooting. Famitsu gave it a 6, saying it made great use of VB's controller and 3D, but complained it wasn't scary enough and didn't have enough ammo. Survival horror wasn't really a genre in 1995, so perhaps they didn't realize the low ammo was intentional to make you flee as much as you fight. In recent years, it's garnered a cult following for being weird, and for a Virtual Boy game, a little ahead of its time. November didn't see a single new game, not even one, on a platform only a few months old. At Space World, President Yamauchi got on stage and proclaimed Virtual Boy a failure. The VB section got pushed to a corner of the expo, with Yokoi made to personally give demos to anyone who happened to walk by. It was far below his station, and widely viewed as his penance for VB's disappointing sales. As Game Informer described it, Nintendo's leadership blamed the failure of the Virtual Boy on Yokoi, and set out to publicly humiliate him. Still, the proud and impeccably dressed Yokoi soldiered on, desperately trying to interest showgoers, who were largely there to see the N64, in his doomed product. Although this sort of punishment is common practice in Japanese business, it was a shabby way to treat a man who had done so much to make Nintendo an industry giant." End quote. Yokoi would ultimately leave Nintendo when all this was over, but we'll get to that later. The next month, December, was the system's last in Japan. Dozens of games had gotten cancelled, leaving just 5 to close out the year. Yokoi's team didn't necessarily need Miyamoto for this one, since they'd already made Mario Land 1, 2, and 3 for Game Boy. In Secret Treasure of the Hourzen, you explore 14 floors of an underground cave, jumping back and forth between the background and foreground to find treasure, solve environmental puzzles, and fight 3D bosses. Not only was it the system's undisputed high point, it was also the last game Nintendo made in-house. Famitsu gave it just short of a 7, saying it's not as good as a big mainline Mario or Zelda, but it is a solid side-scroller with clever 3D effects. It mostly scored 8s in the West, with GamePro going as high as a 9.5. Some magazines thought it'd be a system seller, drawing in millions, though in hindsight, it was just wishful thinking. The same day Virtual Boy got its best game, it also got what Famitsu considered its worst. Space Invaders Virtual Collection. It's just ports of the old arcade games, Space Invaders 1 and 2, plus 3D versions of the same two games. Famitsu scored it less than a 4, saying the old ports were pointless to bring to Virtual Boy, and in the 3D versions, it's hard to even see what's happening. Unsurprisingly, the game never left Japan, and these next 3 didn't either. Virtual Lab's basically Tetris, but with falling organs that you've got to connect together to disappear. Space Invaders was poorly received for not adding anything good to a 1970s arcade game, but Virtual Lab, on the other hand, was just flat out bad. It stunk of being unfinished, and Famitsu gave it a 4, citing the lack of fun, frustrating difficulty, and because, quote, there's no 3D effects, except for a woman swaying breasts in the bottom right corner. If you saw our recent video on the Sufami Turbo, this game will look familiar. Just like the 6SD Gundam games on Turbo, Dimension War's a grid-based tactical RPG similar to Advance Wars and Fire Emblem. On Turbo, battles are just cutscenes, but here, most battles are fought real-time in 3D space. Developers who made VB games generally understood long play sessions were tiring for your eyes, so they stuck to genres you could play in short bursts. Bandai bucked that trend and made a tactics game anyway, but simplified the formula for shorter levels. Famitsu was mixed on the results though, and gave it just under a 5. Virtual Bowling's got multiple modes and bells and whistles, like being able to adjust the weight of your ball and how much wax you want on the lanes. Famitsu gave it a 5.5 for being fun, realistic, and making the best use of VB hardware of any sports title. Besides its great 3D, it also uses both D-pads, one for moving and one for aiming. There's only so much you can do with a bowling game. That said, Virtual Bowling's about as good as it could get on Virtual Boy. And that was it. Only 19 VB games ever released in Japan, and those were the last of them. The same day Gundam and Bowling came out, December 22nd, 1995, Nintendo quietly discontinued the system without announcement. Since launch, they'd only sold a little over 100,000 systems, when they originally thought they were gonna sell millions. Things were going better stateside though. They'd expected to sell around 1 million by now, and they'd achieved 70% of that goal. So in America, VB wasn't discontinued, and got 3 more games into early '96, with plans to continue even longer. The first was Waterworld, based on the film of the same name. You play as Kevin Costner, zipping around on a jet ski shooting pirates, trying to stop them from kidnapping civilians. GamePro magazine said, quote, "Repetitive sights pollute the water. Identical enemies and victims appear in every level. A bad film makes for an even worse game in this boring shooter. Waterworld is a Virtual Boy's wet nightmare." On average, reviewers gave it a 5. Virtual Bowling never came to America, so they got Nes's Funky Bowling instead. The game was made in Utah and stars Nestor, who'd been Nintendo Power Magazine's mascot up until 1993. But by '96, he'd long since been retired, making him an odd choice for a bowling game aimed at Americans. In short, it's unremarkable aside from the branding, and not as good as the bowling game they got in Japan. Reviews averaged 5.5, brought up by Nintendo Power's own review of 6.7. The final Virtual Boy game ever released landed on March 22nd, 1996. Americans didn't get V-Tetris, but they did get 3D Tetris. It's basically classic Tetris, but you're looking down from above, with Tetronimos falling into a 5x5 cube. Magazines gave it a 6, with props for good 3D effects, but points off for lackluster sound and music, as well as being less fun than its Game Boy forebear. That was the day Virtual Boy died, though no one knew it yet. For a while, the plan was to regroup and have another go of it in America, considering how much better it was selling than in Japan. A second wave of games was in the works that'd do more to take advantage of the Virtual Boy's unique features. Yamauchi said, "Virtual Boy was created to provide a different kind of gameplay compared to TV games, but it released without any games that took advantage of that distinction. So now I want to return to the starting point and find titles that emphasize the difference that Virtual Boy games can provide. I want to start afresh in 1996. At E3 in May, Nintendo of America renewed their pledge to support the system and announced an aggressive price cut to $99. Games were made cheaper too, down to $30 or $40. NOA projected they would sell another 300,000 systems in the coming year, and showed off a couple games to kick off VB's second wave. The first was Bound High, a top-down action puzzle game that made excellent use of 3D. As Chalvo the robot, you defend Earth from aliens by bouncing around stages on top of enemies to kill them, and trying not to fall to your death. Bound High had 4 modes, including a story campaign with bosses every 10 levels. Yamauchi called it the most promising title coming to the system. There was also Dragon Hopper, developed by Intelligent Systems, the studio that did Fire Emblem, Paper Mario, and helped make Super Metroid. It was a top-down action-adventure akin to Zelda Link's Awakening, where you play as Prince Dorin, trying to make his way to the kingdom of Celestia to save his family from its corrupt prime minister. It had everything you'd expect in an adventure game: NPCs, monsters, currency, shops, and so on, but with added 3D. G0 was revealed soon after, an F-Zero spin-off where instead of driving on flat roads, you're flying through space, with Captain Falcon and other familiar faces like James McCloud. All 3 games were gonna release soon, and more were in the works as well, like VB Mario Kart, Donkey Kong Country, Bomberman, and a GoldenEye racing game. But then, all of a sudden, it all disappeared. G0, Bound High, and Dragon Hopper were 100% finished. They'd been rated by the ESRB, and according to our sources at NOA, even their boxes and manuals were done. But then Nintendo stuck them in a vault, cut bait, and ran. Every third-party game was cancelled too. Maybe we'll talk about every cancelled Virtual Boy game in a separate video someday, like we did with 64DD. There's about 40, which is too many to cover here in sufficient detail. The upshot, though, is that Nintendo decided to push VB out to sea, so they could focus all resources on N64 in hopes of beating Sony in the home console war. Yokoi famously resigned from Nintendo just as all this went down, in August '96. According to legend, that's why he quit, to accept responsibility for VB's failure. But in reality, he wrote an article called Why I Left Nintendo soon after, saying he'd actually wanted to leave for some time. He was going to leave a few years earlier when he turned 50, but stayed a little longer to see Virtual Boy through. At the start of the project, he wanted VR32 to be his farewell gift to Nintendo, and his way of going out on a high note. But when it failed, he quickly threw together blueprints for Game Boy Pocket, since it'd be quick, easy, and a surefire success. It released July 21st, 1996, 1 year to the day after Virtual Boy. Then he left to start his own company, where he could keep making fun inventions like the old days, escape the bit wars, and keep things small, without having to manage a huge department and worry about Nintendo's office politics. It wasn't the same Nintendo it used to be, and he didn't think he belonged there anymore. A few guys from R&D 1 went with him. Together, they designed the Wonder Swan, which was better than Game Boy in basically every way, and was going to sell for a much lower price. But before it came out, he was killed in a tragic car accident. As his longtime protege, Miyamoto personally designed his gravestone and gave the eulogy at his funeral, where he said Yokoi had made Nintendo what it is today. For more on Yokoi, see our recent biographical video covering his full life story. There's so much more to the man than just Virtual Boy, and it's a shame that's what so many remember him for. His legacy extends well beyond his death, up to this very day, in fact. Back to this video's topic though, the Virtual Boy and legacy it left behind. By late '96, clearance shelves were littered with them for as cheap as $20. The old boy never even made it to Europe. Despite its short lifespan, or maybe because of it, a small but passionate fanbase has formed in the decades since. In 2010, they finally got their hands on Bound High, which it turns out really was the system's best game. Nowadays, you can get it in a boxed cartridge or just play on emulator. Something similar happened with an FPS called Faceball a few years later. Fans have also made their own VB games like Star Fox and Mario Kart Virtual Cup, and some cheeky ports as well, like Snatcher and Street Fighter 2. Not to mention lots of original games like Elevated Speed, and right now they're making a Portal-inspired project called Test Chamber. They even made Virtual Boy link cables and modded multiplayer back into games like Mario's Tennis. Nintendo never got around to it, so fans figured they'd do it themselves. Speaking of what Nintendo don't, at a 2013 shareholder meeting, an investor asked if VB games were going to come to Virtual Console on 3DS. President Iwata said he'd think about it, and that, quote, "It was not a commercial success, but some say that it was an attractive and extremely unique product by these standards at that time. Nintendo never ended up doing that either, but fans picked up the slack with their own 3DS emulator pretty recently, actually, playable in 2D or 3D, whichever you prefer. Outside that niche community though, Virtual Boy's gotten a reputation over the years as Nintendo's biggest failure of all time. As we alluded to earlier though, that narrative's a bit overblown. Nintendo 64DD and Satellaview both sold under 100,000 units. Virtual Boy managed to sell around 800,000, which is also more than can be said for Sega VR and Jaguar VR, neither of which ever came out. VB outsold most of its 5th generation competitors too, including Atari Jaguar, Amiga CD32, PCFX, FM Towns Marty, and Bandai Pippin. And also some of that generation's handhelds, like Neo Geo Pocket, Game.com, and Game Boy Light. And that's with Virtual Boy only really being on the market for 5 months. For a while, it was on track to outsell some bigger systems too. In the US, for example, Sega Saturn had twice the marketing budget and launched with a 2-month head start. Nintendo's Howard Lincoln recalls, "In 1995, Virtual Boy sold more product than Saturn did, which says something. I was sorry that certain key executives at Sega left before I was able to deliver the 50-pound bag of dog food to them. They having described Virtual Boy as the dog of the year. We outsold them and we got out." Which kind of makes you wonder, what if they hadn't got out? That second wave of games would have released and more people would buy the system, leading to a third wave and so on. Every system's games get better over time, as devs get more experienced with the hardware. Just imagine if 3DS got discontinued 5 months after its rocky launch. It'd be remembered as a failure too, with only a few games worth playing. But Nintendo doubled down, turned things around, and made lemons into lemonade. Virtual Boy never got that chance. Now, having said all that, we're not claiming Virtual Boy wasn't a failure. Because it was, but it's not as bad as people make it out to be these days. And if it hadn't gotten dragged down by regulations and its resources moved over to N64, who knows? VR32 might have become the success Yokoi dreamed of. Did you also know there was an official Super Famicom add-on with 2 cartridge slots, with games that linked together and had a universal currency you could trade between games? It came out in July '96, just as the Virtual Boy gasped its last breaths. A year later, Japan got the Nintendo Power System, with exclusive games and the ability to rewrite Super Famicom and Game Boy flashcards. It was basically the prototype for what ultimately became Wii's Virtual Console. For the full stories on Sufami Turbo and Nintendo Power, click the video on screen. Special thanks to the authors of Seeing Red, Yosei Zagal and Benj Edwards, Yokoi's official biographer Takefumi Makino, and everyone at Planet Virtual Boy for consultation and proofreading. From Blitter, Speedy Ink, and FWOW to Zell, Arya, and Emily. Thanks to our translator Jacob, and thank you for watching. And we'll see you next time.